good?
Yep.
All right, so we will reopen our Board of Selectmen meeting here on Tuesday, May 17th. We began the meeting at 5:30 for interviews in the small meeting room. And we are now reopen the meeting at, at 7:05, I guess, by the clock. And before we get going on the business, start by doing the Pledge of Allegiance as we always do. Where's the flag go?
Over there, right.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
All right. Okay, so the first item on our agenda tonight is a public hearing related to a Verizon request. So if there are any representatives for Verizon, if they'd like to come up to the table, be great.
Good evening.
How you doing? If you could state your name for the record for our recording secretary. And then I'm going to, actually, yeah, so just please introduce.
My name is Josh Lanzetta on behalf of Selco Partnership, doing business as Verizon Wireless.
Okay, great.
I'm sorry, what was the last name?
Lanzetta.
Thank you.
All right, and I'll read, we have in front of us 7 individual hearing notices relative to an individual hearing notice for each of the 7 polls that are involved here with this process. I'm going to read one of the hearing notices and then just enter the rest into the record. The only difference between the hearing notices is the poll number, so for the public record. So you are hereby notified that a hearing will be held by the Board of Selectmen of the Town of Tewksbury in the Selectmen's Meeting Room, Town Hall, 1009 Main Street at 7 p.m. on Tuesday, May 17th, 2016, on the application of Selco Partnership doing business as Verizon Wireless to attach on existing pole 1 on Main Street, centralized radio access network, antenna, radio unit, meter, 30 amp DICS, I'm not sure what that is, coax cable and guard, ground rod, power, fiber, and fixtures. The purpose of this application is to increase the wireless capacity and fill existing coverage gaps. And again, all of the other public notices are the same other than the poll location, so we'll just put those into the record, please. So if you, Mr. Lanzetti, can you just give us a quick rundown as to the technology and what you're hoping to be able to do here?
Absolutely. I'll keep it brief and hopefully I can field questions for you. At a very basic level, we're trying to augment Verizon's wireless network in Tewksbury, and specifically up and down the Route 38 corridor. There's really one outlier over by Raytheon, but other than that, if you look at the map, the pole attachments really do follow Route 38, where you have a substantial amount of vehicular traffic, especially kind of during the regular rush. The on and off ramps here, shockingly, it's amazing how much traffic you have there, and it's basically draining the wireless signal here. What these canister antennas are designed to do is to offload that capacity. So if you think of the large macro sites that you have, so kind of the traditional towers, rooftop installations, think of them as the house, and these canisters create essentially rooms in the house that devices are able to pick up as they're traveling through the room. And what that does is it frees up a lot of capacity, even all the way out to the outlying area or the periphery of the entire network. These are specifically designed to look exactly like very common electrical transformers. They're just a gray cylinder, same exact dimensions. They're much lighter because they don't have the moving parts and oil and mechanisms that a transformer actually has. It's just a fiberglass canister that is RF conducive. So basically, we're trying to augment the system here.
Anybody have any questions relative to the technology or the particular application in front of us?
Just, Mr. Chairman, just I'm going to ask you some questions that are more for clarity's sake than anything else. But as it was referenced in correspondence, we have a town bylaw that pertains to this, and I just want to clarify, are you looking for a right-of-way permit or addition to an existing pole structure? And are there differences from your standpoint in those two concepts?
So in talking with the planning department, so we've been before the planning board, and we applied for a special permit. We were granted the special permit by the planning board.
Okay.
This is just so that we can attach to the pole, which all of the poles listed are in the municipal right-of-way. This is new technology in this region of the country and in Massachusetts. So in some locations, it might be a special permit with the planning board. In other locations, it might be a grant of location. In some locations like Tewksbury, we were advised to file for both. So we're just looking to be able to attach in the public right-of-way.
So you've been before the planning board and
We
they've
have.
issued you a special permit already?
Yes, they have, with a unanimous vote.
And does this technology, is it exclusive to your company if these are installed? Like on a cell tower, often they are co-locators. So in this instance, is it only to benefit a Verizon customer as
Yes,
opposed?
yes.
Okay.
But, you know, as I can't speak to what other companies are doing, if they're using this technology or not, but if you look at the way transformers are attached to poles, it's possible that you could co-locate on the same pole.
And in your experience, have you installed these in other area communities that would be in the geographic region?
Yes, we have a lot of pending applications right now that there's a relatively large installation happening in the Merrimack Valley right now. I believe there's one that's functioning in Amesbury that you could potentially drive by and actually see. And we have a number of sites ongoing right now that are in various stages of the permitting process. After we're here, we file an electrical permit, so, you know, some of them.
Yeah. So you mentioned in your opening comments that there was a lot of drainage on the existing infrastructure in Tewksbury. Is that why you identified this as maybe a priority community? Or?
Yes, exactly. These are designed to be low to the ground, which is why the utility poles are kind of the perfect application.
Yeah.
And you have a capacity issue here, especially during peak usage times.
Yeah. Okay. All right, so then one of my questions, and you answered it, was the planning board's participation in this process. But the other question that I have that in my review of the regulation, or the bylaw rather, was triggered in my mind was twofold. The issue of things of like insurance and bonds, and you know, I suspect a lot of that has to do with construction as opposed to adding to a pole, but I'm curious what your perspective is on that as it relates to the bylaw and your process here through the planning board and what you're asking us to approve tonight.
As far as, are you asking me if we're going to submit a bond for each?
Yeah, did you satisfy those obligations?
Yes, we're in full compliance with the ordinance as it stands. We did ask for one waiver, which was approved by the planning board,
Okay.
and that was for, it's on me, it's time to go, I guess. We asked for one waiver that, so your ordinance, like most ordinances,
Yeah.
most telecom ordinances, is drafted kind of specifically for new towers. And there was one provision that was I'll call it a line of sight provision, where it was a 300-foot, wanted a picture of the site from multiple angles. It was very akin to, or it was kind of mimicking what we would do as a balloon, the process we would follow as a balloon test.
Right.
It's really not applicable to this. You couldn't, in fact, get a 300-foot view of these poles. You just wouldn't be able to see them. So we provided photo simulations that show the poles very clearly. And then we also said, you know, if the town would like additional photos from specific vantage points, we're fine with complying with that. And the planning board said, no, that's unnecessary. These are good enough for the application. But so we are in compliance with the,
Okay. Terrific. All right, just one last question, or actually two parts to one question. I assume that this is, you know, sort of an improvement, so and I don't know if this might be more appropriate to ask of the town manager, but is the apparatus itself a taxable item under the Telecommunications Act? Does the town derive potential revenue from those new items that are installed?
I don't think so. We could look into that. We're dealing with that right now on a number of different levels, so I don't have a specific answer for you as far as whether it's a taxable item or not.
All right, and then the last item, part B of that question, pertains to part of the bylaw speaks to lease provisions. So I'm curious what discussions you've had, if any, here in town or in other communities as it relates to lease
Sure.
commitments.
So the way that the companies do this, so each utility pole will have commonly two owners, utility company and often a telecom company. So in our case, telecom, a different company, totally separate from Verizon Wireless. Instead of executing a lease, the companies issue a license, and under the telecom law, the licenses and the rates are essentially fixed. They're very low. It's designed, the TCA as a whole is designed to create rapid infrastructure and to keep the cost down so that to promote growth, basically. So before a site is acquired and kind of pegged, you know, the engineers will find gaps in coverage with these search rings. There are real estate consultants that then go out, identify poles that would, you know, with the right antenna that might help create more coverage. Then there's an internal licensing process with both Verizon, Telecom, and the relevant utility company. And they assess pole structure, whether they do structural analysis, can the attachment, you know, be actually attached. From there, they issue a license, and that's the end of that as far as permitting.
All right. It does in part, yeah. So just one last question, and I'll give it back to the chairman. In your, I guess, long-term vision as a company, do you foresee the need to have both the historical cell towers that we've all become accustomed to in conjunction with this new technology, or do you envision the potential to phase out the use of cell towers and rely more largely on this type of technology?
These antennas complement the macro sites that are out there.
Yeah.
Antennas at different elevations.
Yeah.
So right now, this is augmenting and filling a really distinct gap in coverage and capacity in Tewksbury and then in other surrounding municipalities.
Yeah.
Phasing out the traditional towers right now is not something that is part of this development. This just basically creates more capacity. And it's very pinpointed. These antennas are essentially tuned so that the coverage that they provide is finite. It stops. So, you know, if you're driving on Route 38, for instance, you know, and you're on your device, you would enter one of these little rooms that I described, and then as you leave that room, you'll pick up another one of the rooms. So you'd have excellent coverage there. And by these antennas taking care of that coverage, the periphery is freed up so that everyone in the periphery now has better coverage. So it doesn't necessarily phase them out, but it's a really good way to get pinpointed coverage in busy areas, which is what we're using.
Gotcha. All right, thank you. Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
Mrs. Strong, do you have any questions?
I have a comment that I will not be voting and participating on this vote with Verizon. You're right now, you're still in, have not settled with your employees and are not at the table. You're still in a strike with your employees with Verizon currently?
I can't speak to that at all. I'm outside counsel. I work for McLean Middleton, and Verizon Wireless is separate from Verizon.
So,
And as they are from Verizon Fios, and there are a number of subsidiary companies,
but they're
none of
all
which-
under Verizon, correct?
none of which I have anything to do with.
Okay, so I'm just going to be making the statement that I will not be making a vote on this tonight. So I appreciate the information on the new technology, but I will not be voting on it as Verizon is not negotiating in good faith with their workers at this time. Wow.
Okay, thank you, Mrs. Stronach. Mr. Kratman?
Yeah, I have a couple of questions, and really, I'm looking for more information on these polls. The first thing I have is, you mentioned that this is strictly for Verizon. And so, putting them in certain locations along Tewksbury, I'm thinking this is giving, once again, it's gonna work for Verizon services, but you have them spread out on a number of poles to improve that service. I'm thinking the other companies are gonna be looking to do the same exact thing. They're gonna be looking to put on these same, can you put two of them on one pole? Or is there some sort of an
Yeah,
agreement that the utility companies can come together and work out an agreement so that they can be shared use, or?
So the telecom companies, under the TCA, and then also under relevant state law, are forced essentially to co-locate if possible. Those laws are drafted for cell towers, macro site cell towers and rooftops. The law hasn't necessarily caught up to the new technology, right? We're in one of those classic kind of situations. I can't speak to whether or not a co-location, need to force co-location of these when there are, I don't know what the distance is between utility poles, but there are a lot of utility poles. And if you go out and look at them now, many of them, almost every other, some locations, every one of them has a transformer, which is why they're designed this way. The utility poles can accommodate multiple transformers. Some of these antennas are pole top mounted, some of them can be side mounted at different heights on the utility pole, depending on the pole's height and what the RF need is. You could probably co-locate. Whether or not that's necessary is kind of the question that I'm pointing out. Just being that there are so many utility poles, and I can only speak to what Verizon is doing, Verizon Wireless in Tewksbury.
Well, one of my concerns is, one of the number one delays in construction is relocating utility poles. And so, if we were to grant Verizon the ability to put these on a number of poles in town, and then all of a sudden we get Sprint that wants to put them on town, and other companies that come in, we could have them all on numerous poles along the roadway. And we have a couple of projects we're hoping to come down the pipeline, where we're hoping to do some road work in Tewksbury. And, the relocation of these things, it's just another factor that you have put out there. If somebody goes out and damages one of these poles that this happens to be located on, they'll probably put a secondary pole next to it. And that's another issue we've had in town with these double poles.
Sure.
And so trying to get this technology, the response time, who's gonna be responding to it, who owns it. So if this pole happens to be Sprint with this technology, the pole next to it may be Verizon, the pole next to it it could get confusing. Right now, we pretty much understand Verizon owns the poles, the utility, the cable companies own, and the electric, and then that we have an understanding of who we need to contact. I just have some concerns with if this technology moves forward, and it's not, as you said, it's not under any guidelines really of sharing. I can see us having a number of people coming before us asking these same questions.
It technically is, it is fully and technically governed by the TCA as it stands. I only point out that co-location may not be necessary as a municipality to say you must be on X amount of poles. One, that might not work for the other company's radio frequency. And two, just because there are so many poles, it's a flexible option, I guess is what I'm pointing out. As far as the way that the third-party attachers are guided, double poles. Verizon Wireless does not own utility poles. We have no control over double poles, pole location. We have to find a pole that works for us. This is a solution, using existing poles and then trying to camouflage the antenna is a solution, as opposed to coming, in front of a town and saying, we'd like to build 7 short towers dispersed in your town. That we'd have the angry lynch mob of abutters here if we did that, probably, right? So as far as double poles, hard issue, I understand that. We see that a lot, hard issue to address, but we are just licensed on the pole that we apply for. If there is, the way these are installed, it's really akin to just very normal line work. So lull, bucket truck, couple of linemen, guy with an orange cone, maybe an off-duty police officer on overtime or something, but it's line work. So if there's a town project where line work is getting scheduled and these would need to be moved, if a pole is being moved and then put back, it's the same exact analysis as if you were moving a riser or moving a weatherhead. Same thing, same process. And it's specifically designed for that. It's designed to go on fast. It can be moved relatively quickly. The issue is interrupted service, so there's all those notice provisions, but I think arguably filing with the town, both with the planning board and then coming to the Board of Selectmen, as far as any confusion of where we are, I think the town just knows where we are because we've applied and said this is where we're going, and it's on file in a number of different places. So I would hope that that would be enough as far as
that it is on. I mean, once again, I understand it. I'm not against the technology. The technology sounds great. I love the fact that it could, amplify the signals for everybody. But when there is a pole down, we know the players of who's coming out to deal with it. You immediately call, somebody's going to come out there, replace that pole, those type of things. But with something with the new technology, is that if it's not something that we know who's on each individual pole, yes, it may be in the office, and eventually we can get somebody out and we can contact who needs to replace it. But a lot of these things happen in emergency situations.
right.
How we're getting people out there. Granted, I understand this isn't, if this gets knocked off a pole and it comes down, they'll chase down who has to replace it and get out there and repair it. But I was looking through the plans, and it's, some of the things are in here. The analysis of the existing structure to support the proposed loading has not been completed by the design team and things like that are going on these poles. So I'm looking at, is there specific weight limits that are put to these things? Is there,
Sure.
and those type of questions that we may have.
Let me address that exact note actually on the plans. We actually have amended plans with that note, where that note has been removed. Our design firms put that on. They have attorneys that advise them to say X, Y, and Z, right? There is a very set process for structural analysis. We are prepared. I can show you letters from the utility company, Verizon Telecom, stating that the structural analysis has been done. We can provide numbers and metrics if necessary. But the point is that the letters that we could provide make the point very specifically that a license is not issued until a full structural assessment has been done. And that is standard operating procedure per, there are national standards, international standards, both building codes, for utilities and electrical that obviously the public utility follows, Verizon Telecom follows. As a third-party attacher, Verizon Wireless is following the same code. These do not get licensed. So we do not file an application without a license. We can't, right? They don't get licensed unless the structural analysis is. So we could submit very quickly tonight when I get home, plans with the note removed, and I could submit a letter to that effect. Okay. That's an automatic print that comes out from the engineering firm.
No questions?
Yep, no, I'm good.
All right. I have a few of my own that I think kind of go on top of some of the other questions. So the technology itself, as I understand it, this is an antenna to receive signal from people's devices, and then it is connected to a fiber optic cable. Can you just give a quick, fourth grade level, just so, because anytime we're talking about new technology, I'm concerned that residents might not understand the technology and be concerned about the safety relative to, transmitting and energies and things like that.
If it's okay with the board, Dan Goulet from C-Squared, who's a radio frequency engineer, is here with me. If I could invite him up to address any technical questions.
Good evening. For the record, the name is Dan Goulet, C-Squared Systems, representing Verizon. So, the pole has a cylindrical 2-foot antenna on the top. That's quite work out for this. These CRANs are cloud radio access. The whole purpose of them is strictly to offload the existing. On 38, we have a major problem. You've got huge traffic counts, like at the 1,000 vehicles. Other places on 38, you've got in the neighborhood of 24,000. So what happens is that's draining the network. So these small cells and CRANs are strictly not a replacement for a macro site. They're to complement it to offload capacity. So you got this antenna, 2 foot by 15 inches, a little over 1 foot in diameter, sits right on the top of the pole, and from that, it's connected to these remote radio heads. From there, they connect via fiber to a baseband unit somewhere else, underground. So you have basically a full cell site serving these everything is basically underground. Technology works. So it's strictly, right now, the network is reaching capacity. It's ready to exhaust. You've got a couple of sectors feeding those areas of Route 38, so what happens is, because they have to serve all that traffic in these high congested areas like the shopping centers and Home Depot and all these places, residents don't service that they could have because the capacity load is so heavy on the network. So what happens is you're trying to use a device, you get really slow throughput, you get latency, you hit a key, sit there and wait for something to happen. 911 issue, Verizon has to be E911 compliant. There's a lot of public safety that uses the network. So these are really critical for this area of Tewksbury. The co-location aspect, I'm not saying that in the future it isn't possible, but if you do that, you're ending up now, you'd have to stack antennas on. Boxes that are attached to the side of the pole, you'd have multiples of those.
Okay, so thank you for that. So you mentioned that these cylinders will sit at the top of the pole, and as I look at the plans, we're looking at basically adding about 5 feet by the time, looks like there's a spacer.
There are extensions on these poles, yes.
Like 3 feet, and then now the 2 foot for the
Well,
actual
yeah, it's
antenna?
2 feet, 2.2 feet tall. Roughly 2 feet, small gap to be able to get the coax up to the, from the remote radio head boxes, is little half-inch coax. Out of those units, fiber.
And you said, I think earlier, the weight of these is less than your standard transformer, so there's no issue about structural integrity of the poles by
No,
adding these.
And that's another reason for the co-location, and the limitation is typically an antenna they would put on a tower could accommodate 4 different frequency bands, which helps offload capacity. These, size and design, only handle. don't get as much capacity out of them as you'd like to have. They still offload the network enough to make it.
So relative to the different bands, you said there's 4 different frequencies in a standard cell tower that might be located.
Well, there can be, depending on the carrier's license, right.
So is there any, anticipating what some of Selectman Kratman mentioned about, Verizon's here now, and then maybe Sprint comes, or any of the other telecoms come in, is there any issues eventually of interference from the different towers or anything like that?
No, because they're currently co-located on, so even though a lot of the carriers, AT&T, Verizon, T-Mobile, they have multiple frequency bands licensed by the FCC, within each same band, there's enough space that they don't interfere.
Okay. All right, and then my last questions are more related to the, you mentioned that you've done this sort of agreement in Amesbury, I think you mentioned, or some other.
There's currently an active site.
So in those communities, because again, referring to our own bylaw relative to, there's under certain sections here, they talk about compensation for use of the right-of-way and then rental payments. And what sort of agreements were put in place in these other communities relative to this sort of technology and so?
So I didn't do the zoning in Amesbury. So I'm not sure of the exact agreement. I can tell you that as a third party, we pay poll owners. So there are municipalities that own poles. Lamps are kind of the common one. Some of the communities have pushed for master licensing agreements. Some of them are just licensing on a kind of yearly revocable basis. I think an MOA is probably overkill at this point when I think the company is coming to municipality and saying, we're not sure how many of these we need in the next 20 years, might only give us one or it could be months. So I think it's that revocable license that really is what pole owners are using. In this situation, these poles are privately owned, so Verizon is paying separately to a third-party contractor, to the public utility, and to the
That mostly answers my question, but I guess, and maybe this is a conversation we need to have, because within our own bylaws, it talks about for right-of-way within the town, so in the town's right-of-way, and I'm not sure how that relates to the pole ownership or the use of the right-of-way, and does that happen through the third party that's attaching to the pole, or does it go to the pole owner? And so I have some questions about that we just do it right.
That's a good question.
Related to that.
So we've looked at the federal PAA, so the pole attachment, and then Massachusetts has the Massachusetts pole attachment, which really does mirror that. And what those statutes basically say is that without addressing who's going to be known as who's paid and how they're paid, those rates are set under the TCA. But it's basically saying that utility companies and utilities have a right to be on poles and use right of way. And it's encouraged under both laws, so it's federal and state, because all of the laws, all 3 together, are designed to grow. That's the purpose of it, is to quickly be able to install utility infrastructure, whether or not it's a wireless transfer antenna or cable or new fiber optic line. It's our opinion that because the pole owners are likely paying the town, as a third party, and I think most third parties, whether or not, I think risers are probably a good example. So they're paying the pole owner to be on the pole. So I think that this is very akin to that, where we're a third party, the pole owner has some agreement with the municipality that we're not privy to, nor do we want to be privy to. And we're just going to pay the set rate mandated by the federal and state government.
You know, I understand all of that. I think this is new, and I don't want to take an action that we're setting a precedent where we put ourselves or our residents going forward in a bad spot where we didn't handle it the right way as far as handling the right-of-way, handling compensation leases, all of those sorts of questions. I understand everything, you know, what you just outlined.
There's also a DAS ordinance in your bylaws. You can review that by chance. You know, that actually provides for pole attachments in Tewksbury. I think we're pretty squarely fitting into Tewksbury's ordinance as it stands today. If it was a municipally owned pole, there would absolutely be a cause, and we likely would have probably pre-negotiated a licensing.
Right. Yeah, and I think it also, for me, goes back to the question Mr. Johnson raised earlier relative to taxes on the value of the equipment, and whether that does that come into play here? And I just don't want to make decisions based on incomplete information from our perspective, not from yours.
I mean, the initial thinking would be that they're personal property that would be taxed, but there's a whole other issue when it comes to the utilities that we're in the middle of with the Commonwealth and the utilities, so.
But I think that's also why the TCA spells out all of the rates. Again, it's quick infrastructure.
We don't value what the state does, so I'd have to talk to the Department of Revenue to see how they would value this. They give us the values to tax.
And just to note, I mean, Verizon is very flexible with that. You know, we're here to abide by the city's ordinance. And, you know, our interest is just getting the attachments installed.
What is the timeline, you know, once approval happens for these to be installed?
Sure. So we would end up filing with an approval from the electrical department, and then after that, basically just be scheduled to install. They go in after the
Does anybody else?
Just one follow-up
Mr.
question.
Johnson.
It kind of follows on Mr. Kratman's question about, you know, would there be a potential arms race between your competitors and you to absorb resources on these poles? So my question is, and I have no technology background here other than I use this, you know, 12 hours a day. But if you've identified as a company a gap in coverage due to diminished capacity on Route 38, but because you see a gap, does that mean that co-locators on the same major poles have similar gaps? Or is it possible that they don't have interruptions in service that you're experiencing and thus might not have a need to do what you're proposing? That's a technology question, I think, but.
The way I would answer that is, each of the other licensed carriers, we're not all co-located at the same sites.
Right.
The usage in a given area or region might not be the same. It's a function of the customer base.
Yeah.
Verizon, right now, in this area on 38, is experiencing.
Yeah. Yeah.
They are experiencing those network issues right now. Whether the other carriers are, we don't know what their usage is in the area, and because, like I said, the big thing is, they don't all have the same sites that we.
So
We're going right here.
There are many variables that would drive
There's
it,
many
yeah.
variables,
Yeah.
so you can't, I wouldn't make the leap that because Verizon is experiencing capacity problems, that all of the other carriers are.
Yeah, okay, I appreciate that.
And we can't speak to.
Absolutely, understood. I'm just I'm thinking about, you know, if these are put in and, you know, 6 months from now, is another company gonna be sitting here in your place saying, we need to do it on the adjacent pole because we can't co-locate and blah, 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 and to Mr. Kratman's point, it becomes a repetitive cycle. But it sounds to me, and again, no guarantees, but that every company's, service company's situation might be somewhat different, so, okay.
Any other questions or comments? So this is a public hearing. I just want to list the other polls. When I read the original article, I mentioned only the Main Street poll number 1. In addition, the other 6 polls are Main Street poll number 11, Main Street poll number 154, Main Street poll number 198-1, Clark Road poll 24, North Street International Drive poll 24, and Shawshene Street poll 62-1. And given that this is a public hearing, are there any members of any residents that wish to comment or ask questions? Okay, seeing nobody rise. So we have in front of us 7 individual requests relative to this technology. If there's no further discussion, we'll entertain any motions relative to this.
Mr. Chairman, I will first state that I'm not a Verizon customer, but I do think that I've heard enough from residents of town that their service is impacted. I think some of the questions that have been raised this evening by you, myself, and Mr. Kratman warrant further exploration, but shouldn't delay, in my opinion, these particular petitions, because I think the taxation issue is a DOR-related issue, and obviously an improvement or an accessory can't be taxed until it actually exists in Tewksbury. So unless we approve it and it's installed, it's a moot issue anyways, in my mind. So I think we should take away a message that this is probably an area that it's new technology. We need to maybe dig in a little bit and do some further research with the help of our management group. But that having been said, the planning board has reviewed this. They've issued the permit. The step that we have here is to approve the location on the poles themselves. We have no public resident input to the contrary. So I would, at this point, offer a motion to approve, and I would list the petitions on poll 111, 154, 198-1, poll 24 on Clark Road, poll 24 on North Street International Drive, and poll 62-1 on Shawshene Street in my motion.
Okay. All right, we have a motion. Do I have a second? I will second that motion. So we have a motion and a second. All those in favor of the motion as presented, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
I will vote aye as well. All those against, say nay.
I vote nay.
I'm abstaining.
Okay. So we have a 2-1-1 vote, so that passes. Okay, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much.
By abstaining, that doesn't,
So we have 2 votes for, 1 vote against.
and what abstention?
Yes.
So, is it possible for me to change my vote? I didn't realize that by abstaining that would move this forward.
So you wouldn't have,
I don't know the answer to
you wouldn't
that.
have a,
It would then be a,
It'd be a tie,
it'd be a,
and what would happen with
we would
that?
not, it would not move forward as a tie. See the town councils in Tingsboro tonight. Well, we had,
Mr. Town Manager, I have asked if I can change my vote. I did abstain, and because I abstained, I thought the abstention would make it a 2-2 vote, but the abstention makes it a 2-1-1 vote. So my question is it possible, I did not understand that outcome would be that way. And I don't know what the answer to that is, but that would make it so that they wouldn't be able to move forward at this time, not that they couldn't re-present it. So that's my question. And town council's not here tonight.
Right. You could do a reconsideration of the vote if someone makes that motion, or discretion of the chair.
So I voted as an abstention, so I don't think I can make a reconsideration. Is that correct?
That's correct.
So it would have to be someone in the affirmative that would
Exactly.
make that vote.
I would like to make a second motion to see if we could table this motion to our next meeting to get some
Well, we have-
additional
we-
information.
So we have a motion that was made, a seconded, and we had a vote.
You have to have a reconsideration to even table, correct?
Yeah, I'll make a motion to reconsider the vote.
Well, you put me in a difficult position, and as a courtesy to a colleague, I will second your motion, Mr. Kratman, strictly as a courtesy, but we've all been at this a long time, and the vote was taken, and I think we should take some lessons from that as well. So I'll make a second as a courtesy.
Okay, so we have a motion, a second to reconsider the vote. All those in favor, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? No. So we'll reconsider that vote. So now, again, we have
I'll offer the same motion I previously
we
offered.
have a motion to approve the recommendation, the request at hand. I will second that motion again. So we'll take that vote, and then we'll consider any other motions depending on how that happens. So at this point, we have a motion to approve, and I have seconded it. All those in favor of approving the request in front of us, all 7 polls, please indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed?
Opposed.
And I will vote aye as well. That is 2-2, so therefore it will fail. At that point, I'll entertain any other motions.
I make a motion to postpone this to the next meeting, to table it to our next meeting till we can get additional information.
Okay, so we have a motion to reconsider the application at our next meeting, which would be June 7th. I don't think we currently have any hearings scheduled on that, so I would say 7
7
o'clock.
Mr. Chairman, before any second is offered,
Yes.
could I ask through you to Mr. Kratman if he could maybe specify what exactly information he's looking for so that the proponent and maybe the town manager can pursue those specific points of information?
Well, the information is particularly once again, we have some questions on the installation of these and the use, and I understand the locations, but I understand what they're going to, just the locations and the more information on shared use. There is no shared use on these type of things, on these poles. And my concern is that we'll have multiple applicants coming in here, and they'll be going on every pole in areas because everybody's gonna want one of these on there. Instead of having a shared use, we'll have multiple locations of these new technology put up.
So we have a request for additional information relative to pole location co-localization. Is that something?
And I will
Yep.
second his motion to postpone till June 7th.
Okay. We have a motion and a second. All those in favor of tabling or reconsidering the application on June 7th at 7 PM, pending information to be provided, please indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? I will vote aye as well. So I have a 3-0-1, I believe, an abstention.
I will vote in the affirmative.
Affirmative, I'm sorry. So 4, that is unanimous. So we will reconsider this pending additional information by Mr. Kratman, and perhaps additional information, additional communication between our office and Selco partnership relative to
Can I
that.
ask one question?
Absolutely.
Just, will there be some sort of staff report or something? I'm just not clear on the question of location.
Mhm.
I can't speak to, we can't speak to any other carrier.
Sure.
And so will there be a report or maybe drafted questions that we could possibly answer? Or
I can I'll draft a letter to send you.
thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. And I would just like to take a moment, if you don't mind, Mr. Chairman, to apologize. I realize that I have been at this for before, but I'm a little rusty and still working on getting up to speed. My apologies.
Understood. We move on. We're all right. Okay. Next item on our agenda is for resident comments. Are there any residents that are present that would like to comment on anything to the board? Seeing no one rising to the microphone, we'll move on to the next items on our agenda. Under new business, we have TJ Callahan's requesting special entertainment hours. Okay. And this is a request from Ryan Corp., DBA, doing business as TJ Callahan's Pub, and they're hosting a fundraiser on June 4th, 2016 for the Lowell Fire Department Education Program that helps juveniles at risk, and they would like to extend their entertainment license for one day on June 4th. The current license is from 8 p.m. to 12:30, and they would like to begin at 2 p.m. I don't see anybody from Callahan's here to discuss the request. I believe this is something that they've done in the past.
This is something they've done in the past.
Do we know if they've notified any of the residents that live in that area, where it sits at the end of Colonial there?
Mr. Chairman, I can't speak specifically to this request, but I do know, because this has been a long-standing practice that was instituted some years ago with the Board of Selectmen's encouragement, and this particular establishment has what I would consider to be a very strong track record of communication with the residents in the immediate vicinity. To my recollection, we've approved probably 10 or 12 of these requests over the last few years, and we've not had any negative feedback from the neighborhood. This is not extending hours late into the evening. It's actually starting earlier on I assume, a weekend day.
I believe that's a Saturday.
Saturday, yeah. So from that standpoint, I can't say that, they have gone out and done a door-to-door on this request, but I would believe that their record supports consideration, and I'll be happy to offer a motion to approve the request.
Okay, I have a motion to approve the request.
I second that.
A second, any further commentary? Okay, I have a motion and a second to approve the request for the extended entertainment license from, instead of starting at 8 p.m. to start at 2 p.m. on June 4th, 2016. All those in favor, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Chair votes aye as well. So it's a 4 and unanimous vote. Okay. Next item on our agenda was the zoning bylaw committee appointments. As we mentioned at the outset, we interviewed 3 individuals. Originally was planned for 4. We had 1 individual remove themselves from consideration. Does anybody have any action that they would like to take relative to the zoning bylaw?
Mr. Chairman,
Yes, Mrs. Strong.
is it possible for us to table this until all of the rest of the interviews are done? Or is that up for consideration? Are you looking for a actual appointment tonight?
We have, on the agenda, we can either make appointments, or we could choose to table it. As we mentioned,
And how many residents?
there are 3 resident spots. We have interviewed 3, one of which had applied for multiple committees, and so there's some consideration as to, as you mentioned, the additional interviews that we expect to do in the next 2 weeks. And so tabling this decision certainly would be a reasonable approach going forward.
Tabling it is not a problem until we address other committees and
So if you'd like to
I
make
would
that in
like to
form of
make-
motion?
I would. I would like to make a motion to table the appointments of the zoning bylaw committee until all of the other interviews are completed. I'm not sure whether that's going to be the June 7th or the June 21st meeting, so I'd just like to note that for the record.
Could we modify the motion to a future meeting?
Yes, I can, thank you.
So we have a motion to table appointments to the zoning bylaw committee to a future Board of Selectmen meeting. Do I have a second?
I'll second that.
Okay, a motion and a second. All those in favor of tabling those appointments, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Chair votes aye as well.
Mr. Chairman, just one comment on that as well. Those three individuals that we spent time with this evening, I just would like to make note that tabling this is not a reflection on their qualification for the positions. It's a reflection of our desire to have full participation by the community, and also perhaps more than 3 applicants for 3 positions, which is one of the reasons why we've encouraged new people to get involved, and we've established a policy of conducting interviews. So I don't want any of those 3 people to be discouraged about this conversation. As you know from the meetings or interviews that we had with each of them, it was explained that this could be a process that takes a few weeks to a month or so to unfold. But I don't want anyone to take an inference that we're dissatisfied with the applicants that have taken the time to apply.
Thank you for that.
Appreciate that.
That's important to note. I agree entirely. Okay, next item on the agenda, the Elementary School Building Committee. At our recent special town meeting, the residents voted to appropriate $1.1 million to conduct a feasibility study relative to building a new or multiple elementary schools. Part of that task will be both that determination as to where any school or how many schools would be built will be conducted by this Elementary School Building Committee. The committee itself is, by rule through the MSBA, is very clear as to the membership. Most of the members, this is an 11-member committee. 9 of those members have to be from various town committees and boards and staff and departments. And so there are 2 openings for committee members from the residents. The